Hey everyone, this is Pico Entertainment and we're back again, and here now we have another fun debate for you, and we're going to talk about James Bond and the Daniel Craig era of films. Now that his last installment, No Time to Die, has been on release for over a week, we can now take a look on his overall run and ask whether his take was a good one for the character or not. Now there'll likely be spoilers for all of Daniel Craig's movies during this discussion, so just beware when you were watching this video. So when talking about his run as James Bond, we go back to the beginning of 2006 when he was initially cast in the role, and this was following a very successful run by Pierce Brosnan, who very much had the slick charm and humour that we associate so much with James Bond. But after his final entry, Die Another Day, in 2002, the producers felt that they had to keep up with the current climate of big blockbuster movies, which very much saw the era of the more deconstructive hero. We were now dealing with lead characters who were far more reluctant when it came to saving the world as opposed to James Bond, and a classic version who always embraced his role in terms of saving the world. This new type of hero was fueled very much in particular by the Jason Bourne films. Ethan Hunt was very prominent from the Mission Impossible movies, and we'd also seen the same deconstruction in terms of Batman with Batman Begins by Christopher Nolan. So the producers of the James Bond films felt they needed to strip Bond more of the fantasy and adventure elements and add a lot more grit, edge and realism. So they went ahead with Daniel Craig's casting, who as an actor was far less highly prolific. He was probably known best recently for his role in Layer Cake, which is a very good film. I also felt he was very good in Steven Spielberg's Munich, which is also a great film. So at the time when they cast Daniel Craig, my issue wasn't very much his capabilities as an actor. I just felt that he didn't have that classic Bond look, and I always feel that's very important when you're adapting such iconic characters such as Bond. The way that they look, the way that they present themselves, their overall image is important when you are producing movies around the character. But in many ways that was the producers' intent, that they wanted to go for something different, and Daniel Craig's version was far more of a brooding and physical character. He was far more damaged and tormented, and again this is very much in keeping with a lot of the mindset within audiences at the time, that they wanted to see their heroes much more flawed and vulnerable because they found this far more relatable. This was the first time that Bond had a substantial arc over multiple movies. The 5 films of Daniel Craig would see him overall fall in love and feel betrayed by Vesper Lind. He would come into discovery with Mr. White, and very much under the wider organisation known as Spectre. We would later on see a personal connection with Blofeld, one of the most classic of all Bond villains, who was jealous that his parents took him Bond when he was an orphan and had far more of their attention than he did. Bond would later on fall in love again with Mr. White's daughter, Madeline Swan, who would come under attack from Spectre, and Safin, who later on had his own agenda with the organisation. So on one hand, the character was given far more depth and weight, but in many ways that was the main issue here. By giving James Bond an arc, you really grind down the character into one singular tone, actually taking away a lot of the charisma and personality that had defined him so much for the 40 plus years that he has been involved within movies. So whilst this version had much more of an individual narrative, he actually became less interesting of a character as a result. Now when it comes to James Bond, I love the character so much, and any hype I've had for the Daniel Craig movies was more because it was a James Bond film rather than my overall interest within this character. The idea of James Bond himself as a concept was always a super confident, suave hero saving the world, and to him that idea was more of an adventure. Whenever we see him sent on a personal mission, he's never burdened by it, he's never frustrated or complacent about it, he enjoys it. We have a character who actually takes all of these dangerous missions, but it's much more of an adventure for him, and that was the appeal of the character himself. That's what made him so likeable amongst audiences. He had that unilateral appeal that we associate so much, essentially where all men wanted to be him and all women wanted to be with him, and that was what made the character so special. But that element isn't quite here for the Daniel Craig version. Yes, we may empathise with the character, but would you really want to be him? Would women really fantasise as much about this version of Bond as the previous versions? So it's very much of a trade-off here. By giving him much more of a tragic story arc, you take away all of the fantasy, all of the charisma, all of the brightness, all of the more appealing factors which makes him so special. So this is very much more of a deconstruction of an iconic character, very similar to what we saw with the Superman version within the DCU, and also what happened with Luke Skywalker within the Disney Star Wars trilogy. So whilst that direction might be in keeping with what audience want at the current time, when you're dealing with such a culturally iconic character as James Bond, there are certain elements that you've got to stick to in order to retain the character's essence, as well as making it more accessible to modern day audiences. You identify mostly with the character in terms of the sharp suits, all of the guns and the gadgets and the cars, and the fact that he's able to sleep with the most attractive women on the planet. All of these elements are quintessential in the makeup of James Bond, and when you veer too much away from those, it makes the character become almost unrecognisable, and so forth takes away a lot of the hype and investment with the character overall. The core element being that James Bond enjoys what he does, therefore we enjoy watching him do what he does. So if James Bond doesn't enjoy what he does, then as a viewer, we're not going to enjoy watching him, right? So that's really what was lost, I believe, in terms of this Daniel Craig version. So when we look at Daniel Craig's films overall, I'd say the first film, Casino Royale, still ranks as the best. It's the most balanced, most compelling story. Eva Green as Vesper Lynd is easily the best Bond girl of all of Craig's franchise, with Mads Mikkelsen, the Chiffre, being the best villain. Quantum of Solace probably ranks as the worst of the Craig films. It's just such a mechanical and impersonal entry. It's not helped by the ultra hyperactive editing, again influenced by the Jason Bourne films, and this filmmaking style makes so much of the action incoherent, and the film itself ends on such a dour and very unforgettable note, making it far more one of the most unforgettable films within all of the franchise. Skyfall was an improvement, playing a lot more on the nostalgia elements, and was very well made and sophisticated, but again that very much emphasised on the deconstruction narrative of the character. Here we had a Bond who lost his edge and was struggling to get back into the game, again very much pressing on a reluctant character. We had multiple scenes when he's sitting on the empty bar on his own, drinking a bottle of Heineken as opposed to the vodka martinis. We had earlier scenes when he walks into the offices with a much more of a bearded, wounded and weary look. So again, making the character far less appealing and attractive to watch. And with Skyfall, we saw one of the biggest mistakes, I believe, of Daniel Craig's run, is that we actually started to give hints of a certain backstory within Bond. Here we start to introduce the idea that he was an orphan, and how he became a special agent in the first place. And I've always said what makes Bond such a special character is that ultimate mystery. We never knew how Bond came to be, his origin, how he grew up, and that's really how you make the character last so long. But by giving him a tragic backstory, you really kind of put the character in a corner, and he has less room to move or maneuver in terms of an overall personality. We then saw Spectre bringing back far more of the Bond-esque elements in terms of the gadgets and the escapism, but again they furthered on from the origin take that we saw from Skyfall, giving Bond a ridiculous backstory connected with Blofeld. On the one sense, we could see what the writers were trying to do in trying to up the personal stakes between Bond and one of the most classic villains in Blofeld, but once again, if Bond's origin is tied to Blofeld, it doesn't really give him a lot more room in terms of a progressiveness overall with the franchise. But having said that, Spectre did give us one of the most classic Blonde endings, where we see him driving off in Aston Martin with Madeleine Swan, going back to the idea that yes, Bond can save the world, get with the girl and live happy ever after. So of course we come on to No Time to Die, which overall was a mixed bag, and you can check out my more detailed thoughts with my non-spoiler and spoiler reviews, and I will leave the links within the description for those. The movie itself started off with a very brisk tone in its first half, but in its second half it really centered much more around concluding the arc of Daniel Craig's version, when we wrapped up the elements involving Blofeld and Spectre and Madeleine Swan, which did make sense in terms of the overall narrative, but then it took things too far by giving him a daughter, and then, as spoilers mentioned at the start of this video, ultimately killing him off at the end of the movie. As I mentioned in my own reviews, this was an ending that very much felt at odds with the Bond franchise and the character himself. By all means, you can have Bond facing off against seemingly impossible situations. You can create scenarios where you feel that the character may not be able to get out of, but then ultimately what makes Bond Bond is that he always finds a way. He always figures out a situation, he always finds a solution, he always solves the problem. as a viewer, gives you far more confidence and conviction about the character. So to see him go out like this in much more of a dramatic and operatic blaze of glory just didn't feel right, and not really an ending that was deserving of the character in any iteration played by any actor. So for all of the talk about Daniel Craig's version being a reinvention and reinvigoration, by the time we get to the conclusion of No Time to Die, it really felt in the same tropes that what we've seen so much in modern day blockbusters today, when we look at the likes of The Dark Knight Rises, Avengers Endgame, Batman vs Superman. We follow the same narrative where there always has to be some sort of tragic sacrifice, with the hero dying, retiring, or giving himself up. And to be honest with you, it's very much of a predictable and cliched trope at this point within all movies, and again going very much at odds with the overall character. So overall, I think the movies during Craig's run have really been a mixed bag in terms of their overall quality and storytelling, and most importantly their treatment of the character. Now many will argue and say, well, Daniel Craig's version has been a huge commercial success for the franchise, keeping it very prominent and relevant within modern day audiences. And to be fair, that's true. The Craig films have for the most part been extremely profitable box office successes, and the most biggest commercially in terms of the whole franchise. Skyfall itself was a commercial high point, grossing over $1 billion at the box office. And yes, we have to give credit for Daniel Craig, as he certainly has made Bond still relevant and appealing in terms of the modern day movies, and he deserves credit for that. But despite all of the box office success and the prominence within modern day audiences, it's the character, it's always been the character for me that's been the issue with the Daniel Craig run, not the films themselves, which we have to say are always very sophisticated. They're well made, they have absurdly high budgets, I would say maybe even overinflated budgets. But going back to the Daniel Craig version itself, it's the personality of the character which I think ultimately works against it in terms of the treatment of James Bond. If we think about it, if Daniel Craig's character was in the other franchise, would it be as popular, or would you find it as appealing as if it didn't fall under the James Bond banner? And I'm not sure that it would be. So now that we have come to the end of the Daniel Craig era, for me, I personally feel that the next choice for James Bond will see a far more return to the much more of the inspirational and charismatic personality that we associate so much with the classic version. By all means, we don't want to go to the overall silliness and cheesiness that we saw in a lot of the Roger Moore movies, but at the same time, we still want to go back to the far more attractive and appealing personality that indeed we saw with Roger Moore and also with Pierce Brosnan as well. We really need to go back to the Bonds that we can enjoy watching, that we can have fun watching, and we can fantasize again about this being the ultimate action hero that indeed we would all like to be someday, even though we know in reality that we will never be. So that's why I think the direction I need to go in with the next choice of James Bond. I imagine it will probably be at least 2 to 3 years before we even get hints as to who will be the next portrayal of the character. Overall, I would still think we can have a mixture of both. So if we can take all of the sophistication and the well-crafted movie making of Daniel Craig's run, and we can merge that much more with the more classic appealing James Bond personality, then that's what I think we can be onto a winning formula. So just in summary, in Daniel Craig's run with the James Bond movies, it's a portrayal that was well acted by the Daniel Craig as an actor, and at the very least there was an attempt to add some sort of substance and texture. This is very much of a bruising deconstruction take of the character, and now that we have delved very much into that experiment, hopefully now we can get far more back into what James Bond truly is as a character, what we identify with him far more as a personality. And this is what I would think would be a far more ideal and far more appropriate direction and take with the overall character. So those are my thoughts and feelings on Daniel Craig's run as James Bond. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Have you been a major fan of Daniel Craig's films, or are you like me and you feel that we need to go far more back to the more classic iterations of the character? What for you were the highs and lows of Daniel Craig's run in terms of James Bond? And would you like to see that this deconstructive take is very much of a one and done and not repeated again in the future of the franchise? Let me know all of your thoughts. Please also hit and like the subscription and notification buttons so I can provide you with more high quality content like this in the future. But that's it for now. Take care of yourselves stay safe distances, and I will see you very, very soon.